Hi everybody, today in the studio we have Will from Filthy Amplification. Round of applause, ladies and gentlemen.
Cheers. Thanks for having me on the show.
Anytime. So we met about a week ago at the Birmingham Guitar Show.
Yes.
Right? And I found it really interesting. It's just a big wall of noise at an event like that.
Yeah.
It is, isn't it?
It is, yeah.
But the thing that really got me is me and my dad, who was with me, who's also a guitarist, and we were walking through. We were pretty tired by the end of the day, and Will sat at his booth with one of his amps, I think it might have been this one actually, and just played a chord, and we both just stopped and went, okay, and we just gravitated over straight away, and that sound just cut right through. Well, it did. Yeah. It just cut right through that we both just went, hello.
Probably because I was louder than everybody else. No.
Well, that's the thing though, isn't it? Because volume isn't everything.
No, it's not at all.
And that's a big part, I think, of the amp designs that Will's done. This one, it's the Control Freak.
Yeah, that's right, yeah.
So Will does some very complicated amp designs, but also some very simple ones.
Yeah.
And this one is the simpler one, isn't it?
Well, yeah, this is the simplest one I've made so far. As far as the user's concerned, not necessarily... Well, actually, all my amps, as far as the electronics inside them, they're very simple designs. I try and minimise the amount of components. They're all valve, all hand-wired. But I try to get rid of as many components as I can because I see them as problems in the circuit that just lose a little bit of touch sensitivity every time. So I'm trying to keep as much dynamics as I can and build that into the amp as well from the beginning. But yeah, it's only got a volume and a tone control. That's it. You plug in, turn it on, and set them in around about the middle, and that's your lot.
Fair enough. Now, being on the recording side of things, I can appreciate how it sounds, but in terms of the actual build,
yeah,
you just mentioned there that you're taking components out. Do you think other amp manufacturers put those in because they're expected to, or?
What it is when you make an amp, there's a lot of factors that keep the valves doing what they're doing. Just because you've got a certain valve doesn't mean it's going to sound a certain way. It's the components round the valve that make the difference to the tone and how that tube is biased and how it'll break up, whether it'll break up at certain frequencies but not others, whether when it starts to break up it'll compress and everything. But there are a lot of components people put in for electrical stability, so to stop parasitic oscillation and things like this. So you're getting technical now, but they have to be in an amp really to stop it going wild. When I tune my amps, I try and get them to be on the verge of that oscillation to keep the clean sustain high. So before it distorts, this amp's already got a lot of sustain compared to other clean sounding amps, but as it distorts, it gets even more sustain, But part of that is the fact that I tune it electrically, so it's about to go crazy and start destroying itself, but not quite. But the problem is, if you're mass producing an amp, you can't. Every time you put a component in, they're only right within a certain value. So a resistor can be only right by 10% or something like that, or a capacitor by 20% even. So if you make an amp and you're mass producing them, if you copied my schematic, you would end up with an amp that howls and just sets off on its own.
That's something that's worth talking about. Is tolerance in components, because that is a thing.
Yeah.
That it's much like guitars. Amps are the same generally, aren't they? Where you can play 10 of them and they'll all be subtly or not subtly different.
Yeah.
But there are components you can get that are much tighter tolerances, but the prices fly up, don't they?
Actually, nowadays, not so much. You can choose them, but also just because there's debates about this all over the internet, but I've heard it with my own ears, and the components used in an amp make a difference to the tone. If you just because it's a capacitor of this many microfarads doesn't mean it's going to sound the same as the next one. Especially when you start getting high in a guitar, when you're changing out the tone caps, it doesn't make. I don't know if it makes a difference. There's people saying it does, people who don't. I know one thing that makes a big difference: which way round you put it. They're not polarized. Only electrolytic capacitors are polarized, and they're marked positive or negative. So if you put them the wrong way round with a voltage on, they'll blow up. Now I've had that happen as well. It makes a real mess. But
me too. It sounds like a gun going off, doesn't it?
Yeah, it does. Yeah.
I wonder what happened. You look up at your ceiling and there's just a little capacitor lid.
Yes, yeah. So with normal capacitors, foil capacitors that you put in your guitar tone control, they sound different one way round to another. And they also hum more one way round to another. So quite a lot of boutique builders are actually polarizing them, marking which way round to put them. Because what you want is the outer foil going to earth. Well, that's one way of doing it, but that's going to be the lowest noise for sure.
Right, so it's the one you think is the better way.
Yeah.
Okay.
And the way I test them, I put I don't even use any testing equipment electrically other than a guitar amp. And I just hold them and I touch them to the guitar lead one way round, then the other way round. And one way it'll hum loads and one way it'll be quiet. Huh. So
I've learned something today. I'll absolutely try and keep that in mind because I do tinker around with my own guitars, sometimes not with the best benefit. And that might be why.
Yeah.
Something that I genuinely didn't know.
Yeah. So some people could be saying, well, an orange drop sounds better than a paper and oil or vice versa, but it could be that they've got one way round and the other one the other way round. But
that's a good point.
But also, yeah, there's then the tolerance as well is the massive thing.
Yes.
Between the two components. But I try and choose. I use orange drops in my amps, but I accept that they vary in tolerance, and then I actually swap them out when the amp's made of ones of the same value written on them, but that do something different in the circuit because of the tolerance. So I do that at the end when I've made an amp to stop it howl and to also get the touch responsiveness I'm looking for from the amp. So.
So, well, that's one. So, if one way it's going too far and it's going to self-oscillate, what's the other way?
There's nothing wrong with the other way. It's just a different sound. I think interesting at the show as well. The guy who it was his father started Orange, but he basically runs it now. He came over and we were having a nice chat. He's a really nice guy. And we were saying that, why do none of the reissue amps sound like the originals? And we said it's just the components don't sound the same. They're copying the schematic because that's what people expect. They'll go, well, that's not that amp. But it can't sound the same because they sound different now compared to how they used to. So quite a lot of boutique makers trying to get the old components and do it that way. I'm not trying to do that. I'm trying to use similar components, but quality and modern components, but then tune it by ear to how it sounds and use a different schematic. So you get the same kind of tones, but my amps are tuned like the vintage amps where they have that instability. If you get an old Fender Bassman, it will hum. Some will hum more than others because you've got this going on. I tune the hum out and I also use modern hi-fi amp techniques that people have learned to get rid of some of the hum. But I learn from those old amps and apply those things. And it sounds different. If you get a Fender Bassman reissue, one of the biggest differences between that and the original, apart from the pine baffle, is the filter capacitors in the power section of the amp. In the modern one, they've put massive ones to avoid any hum because it's valve rectified. But those big capacitors smooth out any inconsistencies in power supply that the valve rectifier's done anyway. So you might as well have the solid state rectifier. But the old vintage one will be, when you play a note, it'll go, he's asked for some current, I better give him some. So, you get that effect and the bloom of the note that you don't get on the reissue. So it's quite simple to get them to sound like the others, but if you know what you're doing and you don't mind getting electrocuted occasionally, but yeah.
I mean, it's good to hear from the mind of someone who's been there and done that. I mean, I have some experience again on the recording side. Mic preamps are a very similar thing to this, that the most popular one's the Neve 1073.
Yeah.
There are plenty of copies of it that if you run them in kind of a safe level range, I find that they don't sound that different from the real thing. But once you start to push them, which of course is what we do with guitar amps anyway.
And what you should be doing with a 1073 as well, or whatever, because that was a big part of the sound. People getting the levels wrong and getting a bit more drive out of them on the vocals. It adds great character, doesn't it? So,
but with the real ones that are designed with the right components, and I think that's why even if you look at the cost of a 40-track Neve desk back in the 70s, by modern standards, I think it was £3,000 or £4,000 per channel.
Yeah.
Because they were taking the time, like you, to tune everything.
Yes.
Whereas, people have asked, could Neve make a reissue of the desk? And they've said we couldn't afford it.
Yeah.
And I think the biggest cost for them is manpower of having the experts sit there and tune every channel.
Yeah. That's the thing. The human ear is the best thing. And you've also got to work, if you're involved in playing guitar, study a little bit of sound engineering too. Obviously you have, and I have. And
that's another thing that we should mention, is that Will was a trained sound engineer as well.
Well, yeah, didn't do a huge amount of it, but still not as much as you anyway, but it's still always been a hobby my whole life. And
but it's enough that you've developed the ear for it. You know what you're listening for.
And also, you said about my amps cutting through, that I try and design them to cut through in a mix and work in a mix, because, I mean, that's been part of my whole problem with the whole tonal journey I went on before I started making these amps was, sometimes I could get a great sound playing on my own, and then I'd go and play with a band and it'd disappear. I'd be, where's all that bass gone that I thought was amazing and all that? So you've got to fit your frequencies right, and you've got to also worry about phase issues and things. And I think that's also another point. We were talking about modelling amps not long ago, but I think, when you EQ a sound, if you're a sound engineer, you're changing the phase. And it might sound great on its own, but then you put it on the back in the track and certain things are missing. So you've got to be careful how you're EQing sounds. Well, basically, digital modelling is a load of EQing a sound. And on its own, it can sound really good, but you're shifting the phases all over the place. And quite often with the modelling, I found it when I put it in a mix, it's just not as big as I thought it was. And that's one of the biggest problems, I think, with a modelling system that I've found.
I find with modelling amps, I use them quite a lot live, depending on the situation. Something we were talking about before, that if you're working with a band where the volume level really needs to be controlled, like the valve amp wouldn't behave how you would like it to.
No.
But the modelling one would be maybe closer.
Yes, definitely.
That's where but that is, in ideal conditions, I always pick the real thing.
Yeah.
In less than ideal conditions, it does become a massive debate, doesn't it?
It does, yeah. And that's a big problem, especially, I mean, with your high gain amps, which is mainly your thing, and I haven't done that yet, but with that, you're normally using the preamp for all the gain, and the power amp is just an amplifier. It's not a tone generator, if that makes sense.
Yes.
It has a response, and generally, as you turn it up, it will sound a bit better because it's acting at the level it works best. But it isn't adding that much to the tone, is it? The power amp in a high gain amp.
A lot of cases, no, I think you're quite right. I personally like power amps to be pushed quite a bit, even on high gain tones.
Okay.
But it's not the most commonly accepted. My favourite heavy guitar tones are guys like, the first Slipknot album. I don't know if you...
I'm terrible. It's not my genre or however you say it, but...
My idea, or early Killswitch Engage, Andy Sneap is one of my kind of tone heroes for this kind of stuff. Okay. And the generally accepted thing with high gain tones is you get all your preamp gain, then you set your power, your volume around something like 2. Until it's working the speakers, but the power amp's barely getting involved.
Yeah.
I personally like to crank it quite a lot louder. I like not just the volume, but I like the way that then especially on some of the heavier notes, it changes the response.
Yeah.
And I personally like 50 watt power stages more than 100 watt power stages for that reason, that because there's less headroom, the valves get involved.
Yeah.
That really works for me, which is why at some point it'd be worth us really talking about one of the amps that we don't have with us today that Will's made. What's it called? The one that's got the EL30.
Well, I've just called it, that's the high power amp, but it's a full amp modelling system, but all valve. So there's 2 amps in one system, and so it's a full stereo setup or a wet dry rig, however you want to run it. But the preamp is on the floor, and the power amp goes in the back of one of the cabs. The preamp has a couple of pedals on it, so volume for each amp. But the power amp, I've got one of them with 6 V6s and the other one with EL 84s. And I've got another power amp which then has EL 34s or 6 V6s. And you can then switch which preamp goes to which power amp. So you can actually do a really easy comparison of your tones. So it's a bit like a modelling amp because you've got all these combinations and tones you can get, but it's all boutique, hand-wired, simple signal chain.
Yeah, so the mindset is kind of like modelling, but it's not actually modelling. It's the real thing.
Yeah.
Is it possible to run both power amps through the same cabin at the same time? Kind of somebody Mesa did a while back there, progressive linkage thing? No.
Okay.
These are fully independent things, and also Mesa patented that.
Right, okay.
Yeah, they patent a lot of their designs, which is good. I'm all for people protecting their inventions and not ripping people off, coming up with new stuff of their own.
I did wonder with that. I mean, I don't know how much you've looked into that system, but do you think that would negatively affect the quality of the sound if you're trying to link several power sections together?
I think with all these things, it's like with the amps that have got a pentode triode switch on the power valves. Have you seen them? That was a lot of where you dropped a 20 watt amp to a 10 watt amp, or a 50 watt amp to a 20 watt amp, that kind of thing. Those switches, they always sound better in their full open position that they were designed to mainly do, because again, it's about tuning for a sound. When you get a piece of equipment in the studio, you'll find it's got a certain kind of setting it loves. That's its sweet spot. And that's the whole idea of this, with just the tone and the volume. I've tuned it to its sweet spot. When I design the amp, I've got access to more than, all the other knobs you normally get on a complicated amp. And I've just tuned it to its sweet spot to sound nice for what that does, and tried to make it then simpler to use. But with my modelling system, that's why I'm not blending one to the other. I've got 2 different power amps that sound different, and also the circuitry round those valves is different to make them sound right. If you just did a basic swap of 6L6s to EL34s, you've got a big problem because obviously they expect different biases and things, and some amps switch for those things. But then they're just doing it so it's electrically okay to do it. and you're not going to blow up the valves, or the output transformer. But the problem is you really have to tune it to sound right with the preamp you're going to use and with the circuitry around that valve, because they have a different set of responses. And I don't think it's that these power valves have a sound or those power valves have a sound. They have a sound in a certain set of circumstances, and you can manipulate them and change them. I think, I've managed to get EL34s sounding very like 6L6s and vice versa by changing the other things around them. You're giving yourself a harder job because you choose the component that is naturally leading down a route, if that makes sense. So again, what we were talking about, trying to minimize the components in an amp, you try and design it in a way so it's naturally leading you that way. And then you find you have to do less to get it that way, and understanding that helps.
Something that I've heard from guitarists more than once is that kind of a common wisdom, as it were, is that amps with less channels tend to sound better. Do you think that's very much related? That's a similar...
Massively, because one way is one important factor is the relays. They work off the power supply. So if you've got a switch and a foot switch that controls that, you've then got a load of extra circuitry in the amp. So number one, the more you put in an amp, the more it costs to produce it. So then you end up trying to produce it cheaper. So that's one thing. So kind of, if it's a very complicated amp at a reasonable price, you've got to be suspicious about, things like that. But in general, I think, again, you're going to have a more complicated power supply in a switching amp, which then makes it a stiffer sounding amp, which is the opposite of what this is. I've made stiff sounding amps, and one of the ones I do is a Rude Mood, which is a Stevie Ray Vaughan model, and that is designed to have a stiffer power supply. But I get the tone in different ways, and it's an unusual amp. It doesn't suit everybody, that thing. And for some people, one of these worst sounding switching amps, it could be their perfect amp. So, because it is art at the end of the day, isn't it?
Yeah. I think in an ideal world for me, I would have, for an ideal, multi-millionaire, doesn't care about budgets, live setup, I would probably have 3 dedicated amps and then a switching system that ran them, rather than an amp that does 3 things. For that reason, that I would have one that does this sound, one that does that sound well. Yeah, same thing. And actually, if you look at someone like Joe Perry from Aerosmith, I don't know if you've seen his live setup, something like 14 amps, but they all do one thing each. I thought that was
brilliant. Yeah. And who's that sound engineer? I've forgotten. He's a famous mix engineer, and like every compressor, he'll have one, and it only stays on one setting. But he has a few of the same ones dialed up to different sweet spots, because once he gets a sweet spot out of a bit of equipment, he leaves it, and then he just buys another one to see if there's another sweet spot, because he's loaded. Is it Bob Claremont?
It could be Bob Claremont, also sounds like something Michael Brower would do. But then something he does, I think, might be a different thing, where he'll put 4 or 5 compressors on the same vocal or whatever, separately, and then he'll blend bits of them.
Yeah,
that's Michael Brower. It's not something that's ever worked for me, but if that's his thing and it sounds great, hey.
Yeah. So, but you do get sweet spots from different bits of gear, but it doesn't mean that sweet spot can be quite a versatile one. Like, I wonder how many times and on how many famous songs we've all heard, Bob Claremont's used that compressor with that one setting on so many different sounds. That we're all used to, but they're all very different sounds. But tone controls are about there. So
just beyond 12, kind of.
Yeah, Yeah,
It's
about
12 o'clock.
1 o'clock, something like that.
Sure.
So with the Les Paul, again, my humbuckers don't buck a lot of hum for some reason, but
Yeah, we'll get a close up of the guitar, but this isn't technically a Gibson, is it? This is an Orville.
Orville by Gibson. This one. There are two different Orvilles. I'll pull a bit of that through. Sorry.
That's fine.
There are two different Orvilles. There's the ones just with Orville, and they are supposed to be equivalent to about a Les Paul Studio, but these were made for the Japanese market by Gibson. That they bought out a factory in Japan, and the Orville by Gibson are supposed to be the equivalent of the full-blown Gibsons. They were struggling to sell at the prices once imported to Japan, and they were making a lot of their own copies at the time in the early 90s, the late 80s. So they bought out a factory to make Gibsons, and Gibson USA sent over their hardware. So the tuners and the bridge and the pickups were the same. These are classic 57 pickups. This particular model, it was their kind of one of their flagship ones, which was the 1959 reissue. So it's actually got the long neck tenon like the original 59s had, which with the Les Pauls at the time from America, you'd have had to have gone to the custom shop to get that. So you're getting some people are saying that the woodwork and everything was custom shop level, but at a better price. But I paid, I think, 850 quid for this, and it's gone up in value already. But
Is that an original roller bridge?
no, I put that on just because I bent the other bridge, which is quite a common thing, and this is one I had lying around. I actually prefer the I don't like the tone of the roller bridge quite as much, but they stay in tune better. But I'll move back to another one when I get a chance. But
And have you put one of your pickups in reverse?
yeah, for the out of phase thing, like Peter Green style, which is different to doing it electrically out of phase, because it sounds a little less out of phase when you do it mechanically out of phase, because obviously the magnet's backwards. So when you put both pickups on, it'll give you an out of phase sound. So that's that. But yeah, I think it's a great guitar for the money, and it's one of the best Gibsons I've played. But and I've actually played a 1960 original Gibson. I sold one of my amps to a guy, went down, and I compared this to that. They did sound totally different, but and the original was really light. I couldn't believe how light it was. But they're not all that light, but it was a great guitar. So
let's see how it sounds at a lower output from the guitar. I don't want to say lower volume, because it's going to affect the amp quite differently, isn't it?
Yeah.
So.
So still quite. This is a bit like an old Tweed amp, but with way more dynamics and touch responsiveness. Because I'll say that again. But with way more dynamics and touch responsiveness, because the old Tweeds were really compressed and they didn't really react to what you do on the guitar. They were lovely amps and I love them, but part of the idea of this is it's really responsive to what you do and how you play. So even if I turn up the volume a bit more, so just by how I'm hitting it, it'll clean up or distort a lot by how hard you hit it. But
really noticed as well that the tone was really changing as you rolled the volume off without touching the tone pot.
yes,
Which some amps don't do nearly as much.
no. So yeah, it's a
So it's
massive
really
difference.
reacting to the guitars.
Yeah,
electronics.
Yeah, so I go to the middle position, out of phase, turn them back down to about 7 each. You're quite a vintage sound, isn't it? It is a very vintage sound, and that's part of it. But you know, quite good for blues. Start turning the volume up a little bit on the middle. Yeah, very, very reactive to how you play.
It's got a lot of sustain as well, but in a natural kind of way.
Yeah.
It's not like a high gain amp where it's all preamp sustain.
No, there's a lot of power amp distortion, but a fair bit of preamp distortion on this as well. It's quite a dirty thing. It's the dirtiest amp I currently make, but you know, it's not a heavy rock amp. It's more of a sort of classic rock thing. And then, but you know, it'll go to kind of ZZ Top level. Well, you know, it'll do a good woman tone.
Yeah.
It's quite hard
Wow.
to control, but yeah.
It's so interesting that a lot of the amps I've tried over the years, I try and get that kind of tone and it just sounds woolly.
Yes.
So I think the reaction between the pickups and the electronics and the amp's front end, it really is the key. But
Yeah, it's mad. And, you know, there's really not a lot in the amp, you know, it's very, very simple circuit, but obviously I don't want to give it away exactly what it is, but it's valve rectified as well.
Okay.
This thing.
that makes a big difference. I suppose the funny thing is we won't go into tons of detail about every component, but even if we did, something we were talking about before with components and tolerance,
Yeah.
you could probably give someone the schematic of it and the thing they make wouldn't be the same.
It wouldn't, no. But they then go, yeah, it does get you some way there, and then again they're going to have problems with it howling and things. But yeah, so that's the thing. The other thing, you know, at the show, one of the shows in London actually, I went to late last year with it. This guy came along and he was a finger picker, jazz guy playing. I don't know what to call it, but brilliant stuff. But he loved it, and he said, you know, it does that old vintage. Playing the wrong kind of thing, but you get the idea of that kind of really
whole
vintage.
chicken kind of.
Yeah, I can't do any, but
even
can you
worse.
do any? But I'm trying to think of any songs like that. I haven't played like that for ages, but not that I ever have really. But it'll do the kind of warmed up jazz kind of tones really well, but and then also it's the way it reacts with other guitars as well. I mean, the difference when you plug a Strat into or even a different Les Paul, it kind of reacts more to everything than most amps do.
Interestingly, then I'm going to
Yeah.
grab my Les Paul
Yeah.
quickly and
Just switch them out or put it in your hands, and
Yeah, that'd be great.
because if I play it, it will sound different because of how I play.
Yeah, okay, cool. Yeah, that sounds great. Let's see how this thing sounds. Yeah, great classic rock sound. You wouldn't get that out of a normal tweed, though, would you?
No.
But wow.
It may be a little too bitey in the upper mid, that guitar with that setup.
I mean, obviously, it's got the controls at the back, so I could...
So if you were to wind a bit of tone off on that, would that do it?
And a bit of gain off as well.
Does it have separate gain to output? Or just...
I've called the one knob for volume gain, if you like, because I want people to see it like that and forget how loud it is.
Right, sure, yeah.
So you consider that, is that driving the preamp and it's a non-master volume?
Yes, that's right. Yeah,
okay.
like a traditional tweed amp or something like that. But
makes sense.
So with a bit less of everything.
Let's see. I think that's just biting nice there, isn't it?
One thing this Les Paul can do is it can coil tap.
Ah, brilliant.
So, do you want to try the neck pickup? It's push-push. So you just give them a tap.
Okay, so I'll try normal neck pickup. Yeah, it just cleans up lovely, doesn't it?
Yeah,
with that?
you don't.
You tend to get that sound out of a Les Paul.
No.
That combined with an amp that will respond to it.
Yes.
Really nice.
Yeah, it goes spanky, doesn't it? Sort of. And tap it in. It's a hell of a difference, isn't it? It really responds well.
Yeah, and I really like the way that the amp does compress in a natural way, because most of the time when I turn it on to coil tap, loses so much output.
Yes.
But instead it's just not compressing as hard.
Yeah, that's right, exactly.
Brilliant.
So that's part of how I tune it to be so responsive and to give you these different kind of gains just by how you play, is to have it so it distorts when it compresses at the perfect amount of time. I'm tuning them to really hit a wall, because normally when you clean up a sound, you want it to be bright and attacky, like this, you know.
Yeah.
So if I pop that out. But then when you distort it, you want it to go warmer, because you don't want too much fizz. So I send the treble side into compression before the mids. So you end up with a warmer distortion. Without getting too much fizz. Does that make sense?
Absolutely.
Can you hear that in it, if that makes sense?
I can. And hopefully the guys at home can as well. Just a tech thing for you. We've got an SM57 on the amp, but we've also got a pair of room mics as well, which I'm blending in a little bit, so you can hear what it would sound like in the room. You can hear on the recording what it sounds more like if you were there, which I think is part of what's important about an amp like this.
Definitely, yeah.
Is as much as it's great for recording, it's for playing.
Yeah.
Isn't it?
Yeah.
So this is definitely a player's amp.
Yeah. And that's the other thing. It's got a mahogany baffle. So the speaker is attached to the mahogany. solid 20mm mahogany. And part of that is to build in that sound in the room. Because if you think this is 20 watts, when Jimi Hendrix and a load of people I'm a fan of were playing live, they were playing 100 watt, maybe 200 watt amps through a 4x12 or something. At that volume, that cabinet is going to be resonating a lot. At 20 watts, it's not going to. So I'm trying to build some of that louder amp sound back into a 20 watt amp sound by getting the cabinet and the wood involved. So in the room, it makes a big difference what you make the baffle out of. People talk about tone wood on guitars and there's this whole debate. And I know it makes a difference. I've also done experiments, which I'll have to video at some stage, but I think people have proved it now. Johan Segerborn, have you seen his videos?
Indeed, yeah.
He's brilliant. Check it out, guys.
Yeah,
But
He's a little bit nuts, but he's got he's got the idea.
brilliant. Have you seen the one with the planks he puts on the guitar? He tries it with rosewood, a piece of Douglas fir pine or whatever,
I
and
haven't seen that one.
he has the same guitar and then keeps and same neck, but keeps swapping out these different bits of wood, and there's a hell of a difference. But the argument against it is that the strings are vibrating and the magnets in the pickup only pick up what the strings are doing, not what the wood is doing, because they're not a microphone. So people who are saying that tone wood doesn't make a difference are saying that, well, this could be resonating and these wouldn't know. But what happens is the resonance goes back into the strings, so it gets picked up, or it's the way that affects that. But when you've got an amp and the speaker's resonating against the piece of wood and your ears here, you're going to hear the wood resonating too. So it makes a hell of a difference.
I suppose you could argue that it'd make a much bigger difference, because in a guitar, it's a very, very small vibration that's kind of the microvolt level. It's not, and it needs to be amplified. The speaker is physically moving.
At the same volume, you're
shaking the cabinet. Physically grabbing the cabinet and shaking it.
It does. And, not many people, when Marshall made the 4x12, have I knocked that completely? When Marshall designed their 4x12 cab, it was designed around what they could fit out of a sheet of 8x4. So they weren't using, as you've done sound engineering at uni, I did, and there's ratios to this kind of stuff as to how it should sound and everything. So the fact that they made this iconic cabinet out of just luck, really, with the sizes of it, and didn't think about acoustics or anything like that, it just worked, is amazing. But people have thought about it since, like Zilla cabs, they're great, and they've done deeper cabs where it goes to a 1x12 and things like that to try and get some of that sound back in. And so that's all I'm doing when I design my cabs, partly because I did sound engineering. I know the difference it makes, and I've experimented with loads of cabs and different woods and different dimensions, and some things suit one kind of sound better than another,
So you design each cab to suit the amp that you're designing for it? Yeah,
totally.
Makes a lot of sense. I mean, I'm a bit of a cabinet nut, as you can
Clearly see.
But I do find that certain cabinets I have pair with certain amps much better.
Yes.
And then to pair with certain players better.
Yeah.
It's like I've got 4x12s and things in the studio that I quite often don't use because it's not necessarily the go-to.
Yeah.
Even for the guys who you would assume would match with a big stack of 200 watt amps and 8x12 stacks, and sometimes the tone they want comes from a 2x12 or a 112.
Yeah.
And especially for the clean tones, I find a bigger difference.
Yeah.
The blue one up there is one of my favourite clean tone cabinets. That's got the extended baffle. You can make it an open back.
Yeah.
It's not particularly deep. It's more like a Fender cab.
Right. Okay.
Whereas I've got a Fat Boy 2x12 that's another 3 inches deeper.
Yeah.
And for clean tones, I can find it to be quite dark.
Yeah.
So it really,
But when you're chugging on the heavy chords, it's got that bottom end that is perfect. It's mad, isn't it?
Yes, absolutely.
I've done ported cabs as well, and one of the amps I made, because again, I try and tune a product so it's right for what I'm aiming at it and the whole thing. But I had one of the ports you could open and close, and with the port closed, it was just at that perfect chugging point, but it lacked a bit of touch responsiveness. Then you opened it, it was perfectly touch responsive, but it wasn't quite as good for the chugging. So, someone was saying, oh, you could do with it on a foot switch that, just tape like the hole to your foot. You could put it on like that. But, yeah, so...
I've seen stranger designs in practical. Yeah, I've seen pedals that you can get that just have a little kind of unit that turns a knob on another pedal before. I've seen all sorts of weird.
Excellent.
If there's demand for it, it's out there. So we'll have to have a look. Yeah. But yeah, the one more thing that I wanted to talk about. Oh, quickly, do you want to play a little bit more on this and then switch it out for something like a Strat or a Telly?
Yeah, okay.
Just for those who watching will go, oh, I don't play with
Do you
Les
want to
Paul.
play it?
Yeah, sure. I'll give it a bit of a play.
Have you got a plectrum or?
I'll grab one from somewhere.
I've got plectrums, but they're probably the wrong type for you.
There we go.
Yeah, great.
So.
Is it me, or does that sound more mid-focused than when you were playing?
Probably. Definitely. It's my fingers. Because I'm playing with my fingers.
Oh, yeah. Wow.
So I could probably turn. Again, it really reacts differently to how you play the guitar,
Yeah, absolutely.
I think an amp like this would definitely encourage me to sharpen my playing up a little.
That's the but it is very revealing, isn't it?
Just, if you can't quite see the controls here, that's on the neck pickup on full humbucking mode. Yeah. I don't think I've ever heard a Les Paul in that configuration sound like that before. No. And I'm not picking particularly hard. I think my intonation's very slightly out. It's very classic rock. And again, that's still on the rhythm pickup, which I can now, from amps like this, really understand why they were labelled as rhythm.
Yes.
And not bass.
Yeah.
Because that's not particularly bassy through this setup, which I suppose at the design time, that was the kind of amp people would be playing. If I wind the volume back on that, that was still on full humbucking mode. Very dynamic.
Yeah.
Scarily dynamic for someone like me, who's I'm much more of a producer and a recording engineer than I am a player, which is why I much prefer being on that side of the desk. Yeah. But I can feel it. I can feel the. Wow. That wasn't a feedback note. That was a natural.
There was a bit of feedback in there as well, but yeah,
But it's on that blooming point.
yes, exactly.
Very Parisian walkways, that whole kind of thing. It really is based on just natural power amp feedback, I guess.
Well, the whole, there's feedback going on inside the amp, if you like.
Right, okay.
So that's part of what gives it the sustain, and that's when you talk about oscillation. Feedback is oscillation. So that's what I was talking about earlier with
Yes.
that. But it's not actually what you're playing on the guitar that's feeding back. It's kind of frequencies you can't hear, but then they are then vibrating other bits back to keep the note going. It's a bit of a strange one.
It makes sense, but
I'm taking my hands off the guitar here. It's still fully open in terms of volume.
Yeah.
No feedback.
No.
So it's not just wailing, screaming preamp feedback.
No, it's not.
But if I grab the guitar and play that B again,
Yeah.
that's incredible.
Yeah.
There are only certain amp designs that'll even do that.
Yeah. Yeah.
But also stay clean enough
Yeah.
that they're not howling.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's
the thing. So.
So I'm guessing that's part of how you plan this amp out, is to get to that point.
Well, part of it's just happy accidents. You know, when you're building, I'm a massive fan of guitar tech. That's why I did sound engineering at uni and all that. And I've always played guitar. And I was brought up on the blues. When everybody else in my class was listening to Kylie Minogue, I was listening to Hendrix and Muddy Waters and, you know, B.B. King. And for me, the music I listened to, it was more important to play one note and have it break through with amazing tone, amazing vibrato and amazing everything than it was to play 1,000 notes really well and really fast and not be quite as good. So that's been why I got into this whole tone search, because it was so important to me. I listened to people like Albert Collins when he plays he was playing the Crossroads Guitar Festival, and everyone was playing loads of notes, soloing away. I mean, not that many, still blues based, but and he comes on, goes one note and blew everybody away because he had this amazing tone, and I couldn't get to that from where I was. I'd heard bits of it, so you know, I just got involved in designing amps and building tone and modding guitars. But the thing that makes more difference to anything, you know, doesn't matter what guitar you're using, you will not get that sound without an amp like this, will you? So, and there aren't many amps like that about anymore, you know, in the UK. And you buy classic amps and they're not working, or somebody serviced them and they've changed things out because they didn't have the parts, so they changed the circuit on this original amp. And when I was trying to use these old amps, I didn't realise that's why it wasn't sounding how I had it in my mind and things, you know. There are some great repairmen now that do a good job and keep the original sound, but I didn't know who they were when I was younger, and so I ended up on this journey. But this one actually came from my 2-amp system for a customer who came and tried the multi-amp system and went, "That's my favourite combination of all the things. Can you make that into a combo for me?" And so I did, but then I also knew this guy. He writes for Guitar and Bass magazine and stuff. His name's Bob Hewitt. He's a really nice guy. And I'd repaired and modified and kind of like customized some of his old classic amps. And I knew what he liked about the tone and everything. So I knew he liked to ride his volume control, and he liked it really touch responsive. So I kind of like took a bit longer over making it and made it so I knew it'd be perfect for him, and he loves it. So it's his favourite amp out of any amp he's ever tried his whole life, and he's got a collection of old Tweed. He's got a Tweed Harvard, an original 1965 Fender Deluxe, Mesa Boogie, Bassman, all these things, and he loves this, which I'm really proud of. So
he should be.
So yeah,
I think they sound fantastic as well. So let's quickly. I'll play a little bit more on this, and then we'll switch it out for a telly.
Yeah.
Just to give single coil players an idea.
Yeah.
So.
So it's very different again, isn't it?
Very.
But you can crank the gain up a bit, but I'll just do in between those two. Just quite a classic, clean sound. It'll go cleaner again if I back off the volume just a bit. So go for the middle pickup. Go for a bit more gain to show.
Push a bit more gain on the amp itself.
Yes. It's almost that Clapton-y kind of mid push sound. These are classic pickups, just vintage style hand wound pickups. So they're heavy form bar style. I don't know for people who know what that means.
People at home will know more than I.
that means that they're the real vintage style ones with quite a scooped sound, but it puts the amp puts the mids back in. It's quite that Clapton-y style mids, and touch response that he had on kind of his middle period. Yeah, so that gives you anything you want to do on the Strat, or
it would be lost on me, I think.
So, but yeah. So it cleans up quite nice. Do the treble pickup, but I always find the treble pickup when if I finger pick with that, it's way too bright, so I have to play. Plectrum, but yeah. So it's a very different sound to the Les Paul thing.
Very different. Something that's just come to mind with that tone and that amp is pedals. Something we briefly talked about last time I saw you, that an amp like this takes pedals not just well, but it really does a lot more.
Yes.
Than a lot of other amps would.
Yeah. If you went with a pedal, if you were a touring musician and you just went on tour with your guitars and pedal board, and then this was your back line and you tried to play it with all the same settings, you'd be totally messed up. That's the only bad side, because you have to set them very differently. You imagine the normal overdrive or a boost you're putting on, it's going to be exaggerated with this thing. So you could end up with an awful sound because of it. So
it's just something to keep in mind, that you've got to tune your pedals to the amp in this case.
Yeah. And, you can do a lot more on the pedal with a much milder setting with an amp like this than you can with another more traditional amp.
And that makes me think, the whole kind of Stevie Ray thing with his Dumbles and a tube screamer.
Yeah.
How much was it that the Dumble amp was set like this to react more to the pedals, do you think?
Well, that's a massive part of it. And also, when people talk about Stevie, a big part of his sound wasn't just the Dumble thing, it was Caesar Diaz modding his amps. His guitar tech modded his amps for him. And he did things like take one of the preamp valves out, so the preamp had more gain. It sounds backwards, but the one in the channel he wasn't using. So on the he was plugging into the vibrato channel, but unplugging the valve from the normal channel, which gave the they share a resistor, and it gives that preamp more voltage suddenly. So it's a higher gain sound. And then another thing he did was bypass the vibrato circuit. So he had less loss on the preamp, so there was more preamp gain. And then he made it solid state rectified and put bigger filter caps in for a stiffer sound, which is the opposite of what this amp does. But his amp was very tuned, and it sounds like no other amp really. If you went and played through his amps, people have often said, most people really wouldn't want that setup. You have to be a really good player. It's very revealing, a bit like this amp is, but it is tuned to those pedals. And when I created the Rude Mood, which is my Stevie Ray Vaughan style model, I created it not by copying any of the circuits, but again by ear and tuning it to really work with the Tube Screamer to get that tone. And you've got to tune it to what it's going to be used for, because to be honest, a Tube Screamer sounds bad with this because there's a lot of mids already there, but any of the clean boost type pedals sound amazing with it, but yeah, the Tube Screener actually puts a lot of the mids in. So with a clean Fendery tone, which is mid scooped, it then brings it to a more natural tone. Because a lot of people think that they're genuinely affecting the curve and put when the bass, middle and volume and treble on a Fender amp or Marshall amp are set to 5, they've got this even thing. That's what they're thinking in their heads. But even with the mids right up, it's still a mid scoop sound on a Fender circuit. So yeah, it's mad, isn't it? But
as the designers intended.
Yeah. Because one of the things, mids distort really easily in a valve amp. So Leo Fender was trying to keep those amps sounding as clean as possible. So one of the ways he thought to do it was to cut out the mids. So it keeps the sound cleaner for longer. He didn't design those things for distortion. He didn't want anything. When people were turning them up and getting distorted, he thought they were making a big mistake. It's great, isn't it?
Funny, just thinking about that, a quick aside, that the early Mesa amps were modded Fenders, weren't they, with extra gain stages, and they were very mid-rich. I wonder if the guys from Mesa just went, this is a great amp, but...
Yeah.
And then... So if Leo Fender's going less mids, less distortion, and Randall from Mesa's going more distortion, please, more mids.
Yeah, exactly.
I suppose that's how you end up with that early Santana sound.
Yeah, with loads of mids, and it's great, And then the Marshall thing happened by accident. A lot of people know that they tried copying the Bassman and slightly failed, and produced this amazing amp, So,
happy accidents again.
Well, yeah, but when I tune an amp, that's how I work. I go, well, it's not quite sounding right, and I just mess things around until it's sounding right. That's sounding really good. So it is a happy accident, and then I write down what I've done, and then sometimes I can't figure out why it sounds like that because of what I've done. But in the end, I'll figure it out. But for me, the practical side comes first. The theory's just to kind of make sure everything's safe and repeatable as well, but within certain boundaries. But
again, since you do everything, even when building from your own schematics, you still tune each one by ear, right?
Yeah.
So if a particular component isn't doing what it was supposed to do, you can then do something to make
counteract that.
Yeah.
Well, sometimes I don't even know it's down to it can be down to a group of components. And I don't need to really figure out which one it is. I can alter any one of those to get the result, because they're all working together. Everything kind of talks to each other electrically inside the amp, and that's part of my philosophy for the way I build them. I think, when people started making modern amps, they thought that the power supply to the valves was a very separate thing to the tone. It was all within the circuitry just around the valve, not the power that valve's getting. But things go along that and then talk to the next thing, and so it's a whole living thing, these valve amps. It's mad, but
So last thing to round out this particular episode, I know we've gone on quite a while, is that these being boutique amps from the UK, where would these guys find these? Is this on your website?
Yeah, on my website now. I've done a little shop. You can just buy it online, or you can get in touch and have a go with one of these things. So
it's filthyamplification.com. So it's not, so it's the full
name of it. Yeah.
Yes. And roughly how much money would someone, if they were like, I have to get one of these, how much would they be looking?
Well, this is £1,200, which is, when you think boutique hand-wired amp, 20 watts, it's full giggable amp, it's valve rectified, everything else. Celestian cream back with a H magnet as well. It's, Yeah,
that one that you did, that's the Rude
Mood, that's
Mood.
the same price as well.
Great. But that one had a completely different speaker, and that was a 15-inch eminence?
Yes, that's right, yeah.
So you very much just go, this sounds like I want it to work in this amp.
Yeah.
Which is fantastic.
Just like you, I've got a massive collection of speakers. I've got pretty much every modern production Celestian, loads of eminent speakers. I've got a load of classic speakers. I've got EV speakers, the EV12s, those monstrous things. I've got some classic JBL as well, and I like to really mess around with all the different. It makes a huge difference. The speakers are. The speaker on its own is one of the biggest differences, isn't it?
I certainly think so, yeah.
But you can't just say a certain speaker sounds like this either, because it sounds like that with that amp or that style of amp. You're generally doing speaker shootouts for heavier rock style sounds, which is great. But, then if I went off the same advice for this, it'd be a little bit different, wouldn't it?
It would be quite a different result, yeah. So you said this is a 20-watt amp.
Yeah.
So you can pretty much put any 12-inch speaker in that you desire and it won't go bang, which is a good thing as well.
Yeah.
So if you were to put like a vintage greenback in there, if you wanted that tone, it won't overheat and go pop.
Yeah.
So the greenback is very much a tonal choice.
It is. And part of the reason I've gone for the creamback is, as I said, this is a bit of a, it's a bit tweedy, but it does some kind of classic Marshall-y rock tones as well. There's a guy using it called Mark Dawson, and he's in a band called Purple Zeppelin, and he's he only does theatre gigs. They do first half Deep Purple, second half Led Zeppelin, and he's got a wall of, he's a studio owner as well, and he's got a collection of classic plexis, and he takes them to the gigs and pretends he's playing through them, and he's playing through one of these, and basically he thinks it does all those classic rock sounds great. And part of the reason for doing the 12M is because I wanted it to have a bit of a 4x12 sound, but in the 20-watt single speaker format. So that is a totally different set of parameters. Now, with those greenbacks, if you've got 4 of them, you're moving a lot more air and you're normally much louder. So your ear picks up more bass and treble and less mids. Now, if I then use the same speaker in a 1x12, your ear is missing a load of the bass and the treble, so you need a speaker that puts some of that back in. So, and that's exactly what the creamback does. And then the H magnet, which is an even heavier magnet for higher powered, does even more of that. So with a green backing, it'd sound even more kind of vintage and less bass and less kind of balls to the sound, really. So I'm trying to keep that in there, you know.
Yeah, makes sense. With it being quite compact as well, it's not going to naturally give us as much low end.
No, it won't.
Because you would have to have a much physically larger cabinet to do that. So it's a good compromise. Well, I say compromise.
It's not. It's tuned. It's still there. You know, that's plenty. You know, that's plenty of bass on the low E, isn't it? You know,
it is indeed.
So it's just about looking at your environment that you're playing in, how loud it's going to be, and tuning the whole thing together. You know, people often think too much in terms of, I want to sound like Eric Clapton, he used greenbacks in a 4x12 or whatever, you know, and they're not then listening to it and going, well, that worked in that situation, but will it work in my situation? No, it won't, because we're not playing at the same size of venue, unfortunately.
Yeah.
You know, I'd love to stand behind a wall of plexis on 10, you know, and playing that, but
I suppose the other thing now is that with modern PA systems, we don't run 100-watt guitar amps
exactly
instead of a PA system anymore.
No. And I went to see Joe Bonamassa last year, I think, or maybe even the year before, and I couldn't hear his voice because he was playing these 100-watt amps at that stage. It was before he did this blues tour thing, and he went back to the slightly low power but slower powered amps like Twins. But so he was playing these 100-watt Marshall Super Lead or something like that, and the guitar tone sounded awesome, but I couldn't hear his singing at all. Not that it mattered, I was there for the guitar playing and sound, but you know, it's not what you want as a sound engineer when you're mixing. There's a microphone pointing at the guy's voice, but his voice is only so loud. Then just behind that, you got a 100-watt 4x12, and he was playing through 3 amps at once, you know. So the sound was unbelievably good, but not for the vocals or anything else. It's a sound engineer's nightmare. And an audience's nightmare as well, because you've got no control over the whole thing. But nowadays, a lot of those famous musicians are playing 20 watters because you can on stage. You just put it back in the foldback if you can't hear yourself, or in-ear monitors, or the PAs. How many watts are you talking out of a modern PA that's fairly cheap, you know?
Thousands.
Hundreds of thousands quite often, yeah. And people are going, well, I haven't got an extra 20 watts, you know, nobody's going to hear me, but well, just stick a microphone and stick it through a PA, and then you've got, anybody can hear, you know, with these rigs that are very cheap nowadays, aren't they, compared to
absolutely
back then.
Well, yeah, compared. I play with a band where we'll play up to 1,000 capacity.
Yeah.
And we bring our own PA system. It's one little 15-inch sub.
Yeah.
And 2 12-inch tops. I think it's something like a 3,000-watt combination.
Wow.
And for something that goes in the back of the van with the rest of the gear, it's never failed us in 1,000 capacity places.
Yeah.
Which means, what do you need a 100-watt plexi for?
Yeah.
But if you want that sound, that's where we can go back to the drawing board and
design lower wattage amps. The reason I chose this format is because, to me, it acts as a monitor. It's the perfect volume for a monitor that will just not get drowned out by a drummer, and but allow you to crank the amp without blowing everybody away, you know. So and for smaller gigs, it will always do. And even for, you know, medium-sized gigs. But if you're starting to play outdoors at a festival, it definitely needs miking up. But then you're going to have a PA system and everything there. So it's perfect. So
the number of times I've seen someone with a 100-watt amp and then they put a microphone and tell you to turn down.
Yeah.
Why not just get something that's designed for that volume?
Yeah.
Sounds right. and can still have a microphone.
Yeah, yeah.
One last thing, I know we're trying to wrap this up, but that reminds me that you said while we were chatting before that you've made an amp like this that is a dedicated monitor.
Yeah,
Tell me about that.
That was for that guy who pretends he's playing through a wall of Marshall plexis. So I'll send you a photo of it. And but yeah, it actually is in a wedge monitor cab that I had to custom tune to keep the tone. It ended up having to be ported because it was a smaller format cab. To keep the bass, I had to port it. And I experimented with various ports, but that's got a pine baffle on that thing because that helped with the bass actually, and but it has a built-in microphone to the speaker and an XLR output jack on the side of the cab, so the sound engineer can plug straight in. And then the other thing, it's got it comes with a little radio receiver as well, so that's in its own little box, so you can just plug your guitar into the radio transmitter and it picks it up, and it's all in one little station. But we put an extra couple of extension plugs, mains plugs on the side, so you could power your pedal board from that to save so many power leads on stage and everything. So it's kind of like a one-stop gigging solution. And the guy's playing through that when everybody thinks he's playing through a wall of Marshalls, and he says it's the best tone he's ever had. And playing Led Zeppelin and Deep Purple. And he's tried power breaks, Marshall power breaks and attenuators between the speakers and the amps on his wall of classic plexis, and he said you just lose the tone, every time. And it's again about building an amp that sounds right for the volume it's intended for. He also tried plugging his Marshall plexi through the little monitor speaking cab and everything. He said it sounded terrible. So again, it's about tuning everything as a full system. So.
Mm-hmm. And on that note, check out Will's full systems on filthyamplification.com. I think we'll have to leave it there because otherwise people will just fall asleep. Not because it's not interesting, but because we've been talking for quite a long time.
Yeah.
So yeah, Will, thank you very much. And we'll do some more filming for some other pieces of content, which you'll be able to check out when we finally release this British audio documentary.
Brilliant, that would be great.
And yeah, stay tuned for more videos on the channel, and we'll see you in the next video.
Cheers. Bye. Thanks a lot.
Bye.
Thanks for watching, guys. If you enjoyed this, feel free to check out our other videos as you can find here, or check out our Facebook and Twitter, or our Patreon page, which helps us to make more videos like this. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.